It's good to see church school starting this morning, isn't it? I think there's something wonderful and even a little bit moving about seeing the children gather to learn Bible stories and sing songs and create bizarre crafts that often involve cartoon people in bathrobes. It reminds me of some of the kind people who taught me as a child many years ago. It was at a community church in Minnesota in the US. People who put up with my questions, who listened to them and even honored them. People who took the time to share something that was precious to them and who began to make me feel at home in the church. I can still remember a kind older man who taught my Sunday school class for a couple of years and who demonstrated what I now see as extraordinary patience with me while we played Bible trivia. We'll just say I was a spirited player. I don't remember very much of the trivia, but I do remember his patience. Maybe he could tell that I was going to be a pastor someday. In any event, it's good to bless the teachers and the students this morning. Providing formation in the Christian faith is something that I think virtually all churches see as part of their calling. Most would say it's part of their mission to pass on the Christian tradition in one form or another. But just what do we mean by that when we say it? What do we mean when we say we hope to pass on this tradition? Just what do we have to share? Is it stories? Theology? Arts and crafts? All the answers you could ever want? What does it mean to pass on this tradition? If you ask that question of our readings this morning, you're going to get some rather different answers. Ask Deuteronomy 4, and you'll get one response. And ask Mark 7, and you'll get something, well, very different. Ask Deuteronomy about passing on the tradition, and the answer is going to involve the law. That's actually what the English name of the book means, second law. The book is made up of Moses' words spoken to the people of Israel before they enter the promised land. And that reading we had has a pretty good summary of much of what the book is trying to do. Give heed to the statutes and ordinances I'm teaching you to observe, it says. Pay attention to the law. Don't forget about it. The law of the Old Testament gets a bad rap in lots of Christian circles, largely because of the way Paul has often been read. But when you read the Old Testament itself, you find that the law is not a bad thing. It's viewed as a good thing, one of the best things, actually. Happy are those who delight in the law, says Psalm 1. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The law of the Lord is perfect, says Psalm 19, reviving the soul. Reviving the soul sounds pretty good, doesn't it? In the Hebrew Scriptures, the law is not a burden to be endured. It's a gift to be cherished. It promises wisdom for living and norms to guide community life and bonds to bring people together. It was seen as one of the most precious gifts of God, and so naturally, it's something that you want to pass on to the next generation. Take care and watch yourselves closely, says our reading, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let slip from your mind these things all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. So, ask Deuteronomy about what it means to pass on the tradition, and that's what it will say. You have a precious gift here. Cherish it. Keep it. Pass it on. Ask Jesus in Mark 7 about passing on a tradition, though, and you are in for something else. It's a very different kind of reading, of course. We're dropping in on a fight here, a family fight within the Jewish community of Jesus' time. It's a little bit heated and a little bit ugly, and like with lots of fights, it can be hard to tell at first what all the heat and ugliness is about. The Pharisees, the keepers of Jewish law in Jesus' day, happened to notice that Jesus' disciples are eating without washing their hands. So this is the immediate cause for the argument that follows, which sounds strangely familiar to me right now, since arguments about washing hands are an almost daily occurrence in my house. But there are several hints here that freshly washed hands aren't really what the fight is about. The first is the way the Pharisees phrase the question. Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the ancestors, but eat with defiled hands? They ask Jesus. It's kind of a heavy way to ask the question, don't you think? It's a little bit like me asking, why did you not live according to the commandment of Almighty God and miss worship last week? They could have just asked about the hands. The second clue that we're dealing with more than just washing up is Jesus' response. He kind of flies off the handle at the Pharisees' question. Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, he roars. This is not really about clean hands. It's actually an argument about tradition, specifically what it means to honor it. The Pharisees see Jesus' disciples dishonoring the tradition by not washing their hands, and Jesus sees the Pharisees dishonoring the tradition by getting mired in the laws and missing the heart of the faith in the process. He will go on to point out that they have a habit of neglecting to support their mothers and fathers and justify it through a legal loophole. You worry too much about what goes in, Jesus tells the Pharisees, when it's what comes out that really matters. In their preoccupation with getting every detail of the law right, these Pharisees have missed what's there at the center, living with justice and mercy and love. Everybody in the argument here loves the tradition, but what does honoring it mean? This particular group of Pharisees has their answer. It means doing exactly what the law says, to the letter. And Jesus has his answer. And in this passage, Jesus says that honoring the tradition means loving it enough to critique it. Honoring the tradition means caring enough to challenge it when its outer trappings get in the way of its heart. It means shaking things up when obeying a set of rules has gotten in the way of wholeheartedly following God. And that's a little bit different from the spirit of Deuteronomy. You must neither add anything to what I command you nor take anything away from it, that book says. Jesus is taking something away here. He means to challenge and critique that great gift of Moses. And he stands in the line of the prophets that way. They have a history of doing just the same thing as well, from time to time. So to bring us back to where we started, with the first day of church school here and that question of what it means to pass on a tradition. Is Deuteronomy right? Or is Jesus? Do we have a tradition to pass on, or one to critique? And I would say that by the grace of God, we have both. Along with Deuteronomy, I would say we have something very special and very precious to pass on to our children and our children's children and the wider community around us. We have stories and ways of living and seeing and being in the world that are gracious and grace-filled, words that give life and need to be passed on. There's no doubt about it. And I would say, along with Jesus in Mark 7, that part of the precious gift we have to pass on is a tradition that is constantly changing and evolving. In various times and places, the Bible's been used to condone all sorts of things. The buying and selling of human beings in slavery. It's been used to forbid interracial marriage or silence women in the church. Churches have stood up for these and all sorts of other causes that are so clearly counter to Jesus' message. And thank God that people rise up and call the faith back to its heart. Thank God that the tradition lives not only by the words of the page, but by faithful human beings who catch wind of God's Spirit and point the way forward to God's future. So, if we are passing on a tradition like that, not just rules or answers, but a way of life that's fluid and prophetic and open to the world, if we're passing on a living tradition like that, then church school can only be one way that we pass it on. We also pass it on when we worship together, when we sing and pray and give of our resources and welcome everyone to this table. We pass it on when we serve together, when young and old give of their time together on a Saturday to prepare a meal at the soup kitchen. We pass it on when we deliberate on issues of justice. We pass it on when we take the time to get to know one another. When I see an adult member of our community speaking to a young person here whom she really knows, looking her in the eye, asking her questions, genuinely listening to her answers, when I see us caring for our young people as individuals and making them feel they have a place here, then I see us passing on that tradition in the best way possible. All of which is really a way of saying that your presence here matters greatly. It's a way of saying that you, by the way in which you treat others, by the way you respond to the grace you've been given and the welcome you've received, by the way you live out the gospel, you are helping to pass on this tradition. You are helping to pass on a way of life that's genuinely life-giving. You shall love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Jesus didn't make that up, you know. It's direct from Deuteronomy. It's there at the heart of the biblical tradition, and for all the challenge Jesus posed to the religious leaders of his day, it's this heart that he always called people back to. It's part of what he learned in the synagogue, in the first century Jewish equivalent of church school, and I have to think it's also what he saw, embodied in people around him, caught up in dancing with a living and vibrant tradition. It's not finished. It's never finished. And it's a gift of immeasurable value. Amen.
Mm-hmm.